Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. So, here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy can't quite wrap their various appendages around. They have this weird, almost supernatural ability to look at something that could absolutely kill them and decide that making friends is a reasonable course of action. Not a smart action, mind you. Not a safe action. But reasonable? Sure, if you're completely out of your mind. Which brings us to White Peak Station, a galactic coalition research facility perched on a frost planet so cold that most species needed thermal suits just to think about going outside. The planet itself was a study in whites and blues, all ice cliffs and frozen tundra, with winds that could strip flesh from bone if you were foolish enough to have exposed flesh. The station sprawled across a sheltered valley, a collection of interconnected domes and reinforced structures that hummed with life support systems and the general anxiety of people who knew they were surrounded by things that wanted to eat them. The station's primary focus? Studying the frost fangs. Oh, and what magnificent nightmares those creatures were. Imagine taking a polar bear, making it twice as large, giving it 6 limbs instead of 4, and replacing its teeth with what looked like shards of crystal that could punch through steel plating. Their fur was pure white, thick enough to insulate against White Peak's murderous cold, and their eyes, those eyes glowed with a pale blue luminescence that made them visible in blizzards. They were apex predators in every sense of the word, sitting at the very top of White Peak's food chain with nothing above them except maybe death itself. The Coalition had established White Peak Station 5 cycles ago, determined to study these magnificent killing machines from a respectful distance. By respectful, we mean behind 3 layers of reinforced barriers, armed guards, and enough sedation protocols to drop a cargo transport. The researchers who worked there were brave, dedicated, and more than a little bit paranoid, which was just good sense when your research subjects had a documented success rate of 6 handler fatalities in the past decade. And then the human arrived. Cass stepped off the transport on a morning that was, by White Peak standards, relatively pleasant, meaning you'd only lose fingers to frostbite instead of entire hands. She was average height for a human, which made her shorter than half the species on station and taller than the other half. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, brown with streaks of premature gray that she'd probably earned through previous encounters with things that shouldn't be encountered. She wore standard-issue thermal gear that looked like it had seen better days, better months, and possibly better years. Her face had that weathered quality that came from spending too much time in environments that actively wanted you dead. She carried exactly 1 duffel bag, slung over her shoulder, like she was checking into a hotel rather than a research station, studying apex predators on a frozen death ball. Renmi watched the human's arrival from the safety of the observation deck, her compound eyes tracking every movement with the fascination of someone observing a particularly interesting form of insanity. Renmi was an insectoid, all chitinous plates and delicate antennae, from a species that had evolved as prey. Her people had survived through caution, through keen observation, through being very, very good at running away. She'd made a career out of studying humans, those bizarre primates who'd somehow clawed their way up from being prey themselves to becoming one of the galaxy's dominant species through sheer audacity and what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness. Her current documentary series, Humans, Why Do They Do That?, had gained quite a following among Coalition species who couldn't quite believe some of the footage. This assignment on White Peak was supposed to provide material for a whole season. Watching humans interact with apex predators was rating gold, assuming the humans survived long enough to provide interesting footage. Renmi's mandibles clicked softly as she made notes on her datapad. Human subject designated Cass has arrived at station. Subject appears calm, unconcerned by environment or purpose of assignment. Possible dissociative disorder? Further observation required. Down in the arrival bay, Cass was being met by Commander Solis. And oh, what a contrast that was. Solis was a Grentok, standing nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms, scales that shifted between deep green and gray depending on his mood, currently gray, which meant he was stressed, and a tail thick enough to use as a club. His species had evolved as persistence hunters on a high-gravity world, and it showed in every massive, muscled line of his body. He'd been military for most of his life, risen through the ranks through a combination of competence and sheer intimidating presence, and now he ran White Peak Station with the kind of rigid efficiency that came from believing that protocols were written in the blood of people who'd ignored them. He was not thrilled about the human. "You're the specialist they sent?" Solis's voice was a deep rumble that resonated in the chest. All 4 of his arms were crossed, which was his species' equivalent of saying, "I'm already not impressed," without using words. Cass set down her duffel bag and met his gaze without flinching. Points for courage, even if it was the stupid kind. "That's me. I hear you've got some cubs with failure-to-thrive issues?" "We have 3 orphaned frostfang juveniles that are becoming increasingly aggressive and showing signs of declining health despite optimal nutritional protocols," Solis corrected, because apparently using casual terms like cubs was beneath military dignity. Coalition xenobiology protocols require isolation with minimal sapient contact, robotic feeding systems, controlled environment. The standard has worked for decades across hundreds of species. "Uh-huh," Cass said, in a tone that very clearly communicated, "And how's that working out for you?" Solis's scales rippled towards a darker gray, which meant his stress levels were climbing. "The juveniles are declining. Standard protocols are not producing desired results. Hence your consultation." "Hence my consultation," Cass agreed, with a small smile that suggested she knew exactly how much it pained him to admit that. "So, when do I meet them?" "Meet them?" Solis's inner eyelids flickered, a sign of confusion in his species. "The juveniles are in a secured enclosure. Observation is conducted through reinforced barriers with multiple redundant safety." Right. Barriers and safety protocols. Got it?" Cass interrupted. "Which you generally didn't do to a 3-meter-tall apex predator species unless you were either very brave or very stupid. The galaxy was still trying to figure out which category humans fell into. But, at some point, I'm going to actually need to be in the same space as them. You know, to do the actual job you brought me here for?" Solis's 4 arms uncrossed, then recrossed in a different configuration that somehow conveyed even more disapproval. Frostfangs have killed 6 trained handlers in the past decade. 6. All of whom were experienced xenobiologists with decades of fieldwork. The juveniles may be young, but they're still apex predators with bite force sufficient to crush bone and reflexes faster than most species can track. "Yeah," Cass said, with the kind of casual agreement you'd use when someone told you the cafeteria was serving meatloaf. "But were any of those handlers human?" And there it was, that particular brand of human logic that made the rest of the galaxy want to scream into the void. The kind of reasoning that went, "Yes, this thing is incredibly dangerous and has killed multiple trained professionals. But none of those professionals were from my species, so clearly I'll be fine." Solis stared at her. All four hands moved to his hips, which in his body language was roughly equivalent to a human pinching the bridge of their nose in frustration. You cannot possibly be suggesting that your species' biology gives you some kind of immunity to being torn apart by apex predators. Not immunity, Cass said cheerfully, picking up her duffel bag. Just a different approach. Humans evolved alongside predators, Commander. Big ones, scary ones. We learned to read them, understand them, sometimes even work with them. It's kind of our thing. Your thing is going to get you killed. Maybe, Cass acknowledged, because at least she wasn't completely delusional. But those cubs are dying right now, slowly, under your perfect safety protocols. So we can either try something different, or you can explain to the Coalition why 3 orphaned apex predators died under your watch, because you were too afraid to let someone try. Ooh, low blow. Solis's scales went almost black, which meant she'd hit a nerve. Good commanders hated losing anyone under their care, even if anyone was technically classified as research subjects rather than personnel. Up in the observation deck, Renmi's antennae quivered with excitement. Human subject has challenged authority figure with emotional manipulation tactics. Subject appears to have no fear response or has suppressed it to pathological degree. Commander appears agitated. That was putting it mildly. Solis looked like he was trying to decide whether to have Cass thrown off the planet or just locked in a supply closet until her transport back arrived. Finally, his scales slowly lightened back to gray. You will observe protocols. You will wear full protective gear. And you will not, under any circumstances, enter the juvenile enclosure without my explicit authorization and armed backup. Sure thing, Commander, Cass said, with the kind of cheerful agreement that both parties knew was absolutely meaningless. Solis led her through the station, pointing out the various facilities with the clipped efficiency of someone doing a tour they'd done 1,000 times. Medical bay here, residential quarters there, cafeteria serving 17 different species' dietary requirements, research labs processing data on everything from White Peak's unique ice formations to the mating calls of the lesser snow burrowers. Standard station stuff, really, all very organized and very safe behind very thick walls. And then they reached the Frostfang enclosure, and the temperature of the conversation dropped even faster than the temperature outside. The enclosure was massive, taking up an entire dome section of the station. Through the reinforced transparent panels, you could see a carefully recreated slice of White Peak wilderness. Ice formations, frozen pools, rocky outcroppings, even an artificial snow generation system to keep everything properly hostile to life. In the center, in a sheltered area beneath an ice overhang, 3 shapes huddled together. The cubs. Calling them cubs almost felt cute, which was a dangerous word to use for creatures that were already the size of adult earth wolves and would eventually grow to be the size of small ground vehicles. Their fur was still fluffy, though, with that baby-soft quality that hadn't yet developed into the weatherproof armor of adult frostfangs. Their crystalline teeth were visible even at this distance, catching the light like shards of ice. They moved with the uncoordinated energy of young things, all oversized paws and uncertain movements. They also looked miserable. One, the largest of the 3, paced restlessly around the perimeter of their area, occasionally snarling at nothing. The second, smaller and slighter, pressed itself into the corner of the ice overhang, shaking despite the thick fur. The third, middle-sized, sat between the other 2, looking lost and confused in the way that young creatures did when their world had suddenly stopped making sense. Cass pressed close to the observation panel, her breath fogging the reinforced material. Her expression shifted, losing that casual confidence and settling into something softer, sadder. How long since they lost their mother? 12 days, Solus answered, his voice losing some of its military crispness. Even he wasn't immune to the sight of suffering young. Avalanche in the northern ranges. She was buried before we could mount a rescue. Coalition recovery teams found the juveniles attempting to dig her out. They'd been at it for nearly 2 days. Damn! Even the narrator had to pause for that one. 2 days of 3 babies trying to dig out their dead mother in sub-zero temperatures. The galaxy could be cruel in ways that had nothing to do with intelligence or malice, just the cold mathematics of ice and gravity and really bad timing. They haven't been eating properly, Solus continued. Medical scans show declining health markers. They're aggressive towards the feeding robots, destructive to the enrichment items we've provided, and they're not sleeping in normal patterns. We've consulted every xenobiology specialist in the Coalition. The consensus is that some species simply cannot be raised in captivity without their biological parent, regardless of our best efforts. So, the plan is what? Let them die? Cass's voice was flat, carefully controlled. The plan is to keep trying everything within ethical and safety protocols until we either find a solution or we have to make the difficult decision to end their suffering humanely. Solus's scales darkened again. I don't like it either. But sometimes there are no good options. Cass was quiet for a long moment, just watching the cubs. The anxious one had started a high-pitched whining sound that carried through the sound system, a cry that probably would have brought an adult frostfang running from kilometers away. Here, in this enclosure, it just echoed off the walls, unanswered. I'm going in tomorrow morning, Cass said finally. Absolutely not. Tomorrow morning, Cass repeated, turning to face Solus with an expression that suggested this wasn't a negotiation. You brought me here because nothing else is working, so let me work. You can have your armed backup, your sedation protocols, your emergency extraction team. But I'm going in, and I'm going to try something your protocols haven't considered. Which is? Cass smiled, but it wasn't a comfortable expression. It was the kind of smile that said she knew something the rest of them didn't, or that she was about to do something incredibly stupid and had made peace with it. Trust. And with that absolutely insane statement hanging in the recycled air, she picked up her duffel bag and asked to be shown to her quarters. Renmi watched her go, mandibles clicking rapidly as she processed the interaction. Her notes for the day ended with a single observation. Human subject plans to enter apex predator enclosure, despite all logical arguments against this action. Either subject has knowledge beyond current understanding, or subject has death wish. Possibly both. We'll observe further. From safe distance. Very safe distance. Solus stood at the observation panel long after the human had left, watching the cubs in their misery, and wondering if he'd just signed off on a very messy death that would require extensive paperwork. The cubs continued their vigil, waiting for something they didn't have the words to name, but knew with absolute certainty was missing. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting, in the ancient curse kind of way. Morning on White Peak arrived with all the warmth and welcome of a kick to the teeth, which is to say the sun rose, technically, but you wouldn't know it through the swirling snow and perpetual gray that passed for daylight. Inside the station, however, things were heating up in ways that had nothing to do with the thermal regulators. Cass showed up at the Frostfang enclosure at 0600, wearing standard thermal gear and absolutely nothing else in the way of protection. No armor plating, no reinforced gloves, no helmet with heads-up display, and vital sign monitoring. Just insulated clothing that would keep her from freezing and a completely unhinged sense of confidence. The observation deck was packed. Word had spread through the station faster than a hull breach alarm, and now at least 20 different species crowded the viewing area, all wanting to witness what was either going to be a breakthrough in xenobiology or a very educational demonstration of why humans had such high mortality rates in frontier professions. Solus was there with a sedation rifle that could drop a cargo loader, his scales flickering between gray and black like a malfunctioning display panel. 3 security personnel flanked him, all armed, all looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Renmi had claimed a prime spot near the front, her recording equipment capturing every angle, her antennae quivering with what her species called anticipatory dread. "Last chance to reconsider this monumentally stupid decision," Solus offered, which was almost friendly coming from him. Cass stretched her arms above her head, rolling her shoulders like an athlete warming up. "Noted. Opening the door now." "Wait, you're not even going to—" But she was already keying in the access code, and the interior airlock was cycling open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The exterior door slid aside, and Cass stepped through into the enclosure like she was entering a garden party, rather than a space containing 3 apex predators that could absolutely shred her into component parts. The cubs reacted immediately. The large one, the aggressive territorial type, spun toward the sound with a snarl that resonated through the observation deck's audio system. His lips pulled back, showing those crystalline teeth that could punch through bone. The anxious one pressed harder against the ice wall, making itself as small as possible, which was still pretty large. The middle one, the curious one, froze in place, head tilted, watching. Cass didn't run, didn't freeze, didn't make any of the smart decisions that a reasonable being would make when faced with 3 predators that had just noticed her presence. She sat down in the snow. Just sat down. Cross-legged, hands loose on her knees, posture relaxed, gaze directed somewhere around the middle distance rather than making direct eye contact with any of the cubs. She looked like she was settling in for meditation, not facing down creatures that the galaxy classified as extremely dangerous megafauna. "What is she doing?" someone in the observation deck whispered. "Sitting," Renmi responded, her mandibles clicking rapidly. "Human is exhibiting submissive, non-threatening posture. Classic prey behavior, except human is not attempting to flee or hide. Contradictory, fascinating, possibly insane." The aggressive cub took a step forward, then another, his movements stiff-legged and uncertain. His head lowered, but not in a submissive way, more like a predator preparing to pounce, calculating angles and distance. Every line of his body screamed threat assessment in progress. Cass started humming. Oh, it was terrible. Off-key, meandering, no recognizable melody that any species could identify. It sounded like someone trying to remember a song they'd heard once while drunk, and only half-conscious. But she hummed it anyway, soft and low, filling the space with sound that wasn't threatening, wasn't prey screaming, wasn't anything the cubs would recognize as danger. The aggressive cub stopped advancing, his head tilted, confusion replacing calculation. The anxious one peeked out from behind the ice formation, drawn by curiosity stronger than fear. The curious one took 3 careful steps forward. Minutes passed, long minutes, where nothing happened except Cass sitting and humming her terrible song, and 3 cubs slowly, incrementally, deciding that maybe this strange creature wasn't food, wasn't threat, wasn't anything their instincts had programming for. The curious cub came closer. Then closer still. until he was near enough that Cass could have reached out and touched him, except she didn't. She just kept humming, kept breathing, kept being this weird, non-threatening presence that smelled strange and acted stranger. The cub sniffed the air. His nose worked overtime, processing the scent of human, sweat and soap and something alien but not aggressive. His crystalline teeth caught the light as he opened his mouth slightly, tasting the air the way his species did. Then Cass did something that made everyone in the observation deck collectively lose their minds. She removed her glove. In sub-zero temperatures, on a planet that could cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes, the human removed her glove and extended her bare hand toward a predator that could snap it off at the wrist. "No!" Solus breathed, raising the sedation rifle. The curious cub stared at the hand, sniffed it. Those crystalline teeth were so close, so sharp, catching the light like weapons made solid. And then, gently, carefully, with more precision than anything that large should possess, the cub opened his mouth and closed it around Cass's hand. Not biting, not crushing, just holding, the way puppies mouthed things when they were testing texture and taste and learning about their world. Cass smiled, actually smiled, while a predator had her hand in its mouth. The aggressive cub, seeing his brother's action, approached from the side. The anxious one, not wanting to be left out, crept forward. And then all three were there, mouthing her hands, her arms, her shoulders, their teeth scraping skin but not breaking it, their breath hot against the freezing air, their weight pressing against her as they tested this strange creature that sat still and hummed terrible songs and didn't fight or flee. Rensme's notes devolved into incomprehensible symbols as her motor control failed. Solus lowered the rifle with shaking hands, all four of them, and Cass just sat there, surrounded by apex predators, getting thoroughly tasted and tested and accepted, like this was the most normal thing in the entire galaxy, which, for humans, it apparently was. Cass emerged from the enclosure 30 minutes later, looking like she'd been through a very enthusiastic and slightly violent petting session, which was essentially accurate. Her hands were red and marked with shallow scratches, not bleeding heavily, but enough to make it clear that crystalline teeth were not meant for gentle interactions. Her thermal gear was covered in white fur, saliva that was already freezing into crusty patches, and what looked like slobber mixed with snow. Her hair had come loose from its bun and stuck out at odd angles. She was grinning like she'd just won the lottery. The medical team descended on her immediately, scanners out, already preparing dermal regenerators and antiseptic protocols. Cass waved them off with her less chewed hand. "I'm fine. Seriously. Just some surface scratches. You should see what a house cat can do." "A what?" one of the medics asked. "A floating jellyfish-type creature whose translator struggled with Earth references." "Never mind. Can someone get me something hot to drink? I'm freezing." The observation deck had emptied of spectators, most of them wandering off in states of shock or disbelief, muttering to their own species mates about what they'd just witnessed. Renmi remained, though, her recording equipment still running, her compound eyes fixed on Cass with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. "How?" Rensme asked, the question emerging as a series of clicks and whistles that the translator rendered into standard coalition language. "According to all behavioral models, all predator-prey, dynamics, all logical frameworks, what you just did should have resulted in severe injury or death. How are you still intact?" Cass accepted a steaming mug from one of the station personnel. Hot chocolate, bless them for keeping human-compatible supplies, and wrapped her marked hands around it. "They're babies, Renmi. Yeah, they're big babies with scary teeth. But they're still babies. They needed to know I wasn't food, I wasn't a threat, and I wasn't going to abandon them like everyone else has. Hands are how you communicate that. Physical contact. Trust made tangible. That is not standard protocol. Standard protocol was killing them, Cass interrupted, taking a long drink. Sometimes you have to throw out the manual and try something that actually works. Solus approached, his scales having finally settled back to their normal green, though they still had gray undertones that suggested he hadn't fully recovered from the stress. That was the most reckless, irresponsible, dangerous stunt I have ever witnessed in 3 decades of military service. But did it work? Cass asked, eyebrow raised. Solus's inner eyelids flickered. Medical scans show the juvenile's stress markers have dropped significantly. They consumed food after you left. Real food, not just enough to survive, but actual portions. And they're engaging in play behavior for the first time since arriving at the facility. So it worked. It worked, Solus admitted, sounding like the words physically pained him. Which means you'll need to continue interactions with them, under controlled circumstances, with safety teams present, and absolutely no more removing protective gear in sub-zero temperatures, or I will have you sedated and shipped off planet. Cass grinned. Deal. That was 3 days ago. 3 days of Cass spending hours in the enclosure, building rapport with the cubs, teaching them games and boundaries, slowly becoming the closest thing they had to a parental figure. The cubs thrived under the attention, their health markers improving daily, their personalities emerging more clearly. The aggressive one, Cass had started calling him Scrapper, despite Solus's protests about naming research subjects, turned out to be protective rather than hostile. The anxious one, Whisper, just needed patience and gentle encouragement. And the curious one, Drift, was into everything with the fearless enthusiasm of the young and stupid. Things were going great, really. Progress was being made. Data was being collected. Renmi was getting incredible footage for her documentary. And then the Alpha showed up. It happened on a morning that started like any other. Cass was in the enclosure, playing a game that involved the cubs trying to ambush her while she pretended to be surprised, which was both adorable and terrifying depending on your perspective. Renmi was recording. Solis was monitoring from the observation deck. Everything was routine, until every alarm in the facility started screaming at once. Perimeter breach, Sector 9. The automated system announced in that calm voice that emergency systems used regardless of how not calm the situation was. Large predator detected. Non-hostile posture, but proximity violation. All personnel to safe zones. Repeat, all personnel to safe zones. Solus was moving before the announcement finished, his military training kicking in with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd drilled emergency responses until they were muscle memory. Lock down the juvenile enclosure. Get Cass out of there now, and someone tell me what we're dealing with. The security feed from Sector 9 appeared on the main display, and every being in the observation deck went very, very still. Standing at the outer fence, close enough to touch the reinforced barriers, but making no attempt to breach them, was the largest frost fang anyone at the station had ever seen. His fur was pure white except for a pattern of gray that ran down his spine like a ridge of stone. Scars crossed his face and shoulders, the kind you earned through surviving things that should have killed you. His crystalline teeth were visible even with his mouth closed, longer than Cass's forearm. His eyes glowed with that characteristic pale blue, but brighter, more intense, more aware than any non-sapient creature should be. "That's Shardwing," someone whispered. "That's the regional Alpha." Shardwing was legend among the researchers. They'd been tracking him for 5 cycles, watching from a distance as he maintained a territory that spanned hundreds of kilometers. He was the dominant male of the northern ranges, the creature that other Frostfangs deferred to, the genetic jackpot that the Coalition desperately wanted samples from but had never dared approach. And somehow, he knew his dead packmates' cubs were at the facility. Inside the juvenile enclosure, the cubs went absolutely insane. They rushed to the side facing Sector 9, crying out with vocalizations that were simultaneously distress calls and joyful recognition. They scratched at the barriers, whining, desperate to reach the massive form waiting outside. Cass stood frozen, watching the cubs' reaction, then turned her gaze toward where the security feeds would be displaying. "That's their Pack Alpha, isn't it?" "Get out of the enclosure," Solus ordered through the comm system. "Now!" "He's not attacking," Cass observed, already moving toward the airlock, but slowly, watching the cub's distress escalate. "Look at him. He's waiting. He's a 500-kilo apex predator who has bypassed multiple security measures." He walked up to the fence and sat down. Cass interrupted. "That's not bypass behavior. That's... Wait, is he waiting for permission?" "It is a non-sapient predator," Solus said, his voice tight with stress. "It does not understand permission. Non-sapient doesn't mean stupid." Cass had exited the juvenile enclosure, but was already heading toward the main corridor, moving with purpose. "He knows those cubs are here. He knows we're here. And he's waiting instead of forcing entry. That's not random behavior." "Where are you going?" Solus demanded. "To talk to him." The observation deck erupted in protest from multiple species, all of whom had very reasonable objections to the humans' plan, ranging from "you'll die" to "you'll definitely die" to "you'll die and it will be horrible." Cass ignored them all, already requesting access codes to Sector 9, already planning an approach that would either be remembered as brilliant or as the dumbest last decision ever made. Solus caught up with her in the corridor, two of his forearms physically blocking her path. "I cannot allow you to approach that creature. It goes against every safety protocol, every regulation, every shred of common sense. Those cubs are crying themselves sick because their family is right there and they can't reach him," Cass said, and her voice was harder now, less casual. "You want to talk about protocol? Coalition law says we can't release juvenile predators to wild population without extensive genetic tracking and liability assessments. So we're going to keep those babies locked up, let them scream, let them suffer, because of paperwork? We're going to keep you alive because that creature could tear you apart. He won't. You cannot possibly know that." Cass met his gaze, and for the first time since arriving at the station, her expression was completely serious. No humor, no casual confidence, just certainty. "I know. The same way I knew the cubs wouldn't kill me. The same way humans have always known, going back to when we were prey animals figuring out how to survive on a planet full of things bigger and stronger than us. We learned to read predators, Solus. We learned to understand them. And that alpha out there? He's not here to attack. He's here for his family. And if you're wrong, then you get to say, 'I told you so,' at my funeral." Cass smiled, but it was strained. "But I'm not wrong." Solus stared at her for a long moment, his scales shifting through at least 6 different shades of conflicted emotions. Finally, he stepped aside. "I'm coming with you. Armed. And if that creature makes one aggressive move, you'll stun me and drag me to safety. Yeah, I know the drill." They made their way to Sector 9, Renmi following at what she considered a safe distance, which was approximately 2 corridors back with multiple emergency exits mapped out. The security team was already there, weapons ready, looking at Cass like she was volunteering for execution. Through the reinforced windows, Shardwing remained exactly where he'd been, sitting in the snow like a monument to patience and controlled power. His eyes tracked their approach, intelligent and assessing. Cass stood at the inner door, the last barrier between her and the Alpha. Her hands, still marked from the cub's enthusiasm, rested on the access panel. Last chance for anyone to tell me this is a terrible idea. It is a terrible idea, Solis said. Noted. Cass keyed the door open. The cold hit first, that brutal white peak cold that made the station's climate control feel tropical by comparison. Then the scent, wild, animal, the musk of something that ruled its territory through strength and survival. And finally, the presence. Shardwing was massive in a way that recordings and distance didn't quite capture. He could fit Cass's entire body in his mouth without straining. He didn't move, just watched as she stepped out into the snow. No weapons, no protection. Nothing but crazy human confidence, and hopefully not misplaced trust. Cass walked forward slowly, hands visible, posture non-threatening. She stopped about 5 meters away, close enough to talk, far enough to run if her calculations were catastrophically wrong. "Hey there, big guy," she said softly. "I've been taking care of your cubs. They miss you. You miss them?" Shardwing's head lowered, those glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like being scanned, assessed, judged at some fundamental level. Then his nose lifted, scenting the air, and Cass realized what he was smelling. The cub's scent. All over her clothes, her skin, her marked hands. The Alpha rose to his feet, impossibly huge, all muscle and predatory grace, and took one step forward. Solis's rifle came up, but Cass held out a hand in warning, not looking away from Shardwing. Another step, another. Close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive body. See the individual scars that mapped a history of survival. Count the teeth that could end her in seconds. Shardwing lowered his head, pressed his massive skull against her torso, and the force of it nearly knocked her backward. It was a gesture the researchers had documented in pack interactions. Skull pressing. A sign of acceptance, of trust, of family bonds being acknowledged. The Alpha was claiming her as part of his pack structure, recognizing her role with the cubs, giving approval in the only language that mattered. Cass's hands came up, rested against the thick fur of his neck, and she laughed, relieved, exhausted, triumphant. "Yeah, you're a good dad, aren't you? Want to see your kids?" Behind the barriers, Solis slowly lowered his rifle, his scales shifting to a color that didn't have a human translation, but roughly meant, "I have witnessed something impossible, and now must reconsider everything." Renmai's recording equipment captured the moment from 6 different angles, and her notes for the day consisted of a single repeated phrase: impossible, impossible, impossible. And yet, getting a 500-kilo apex predator through a research facility designed to keep apex predators out turned out to be a bureaucratic nightmare that made actual nightmares look pleasant by comparison. But Cass had momentum now, and momentum combined with human stubbornness was a force that could apparently move mountains, or at least move paperwork fast enough to give administrators headaches. Shardwing followed her through the corridors like the world's most terrifying puppy, his massive form somehow navigating the spaces without destroying anything important. Personnel flattened themselves against walls, fled into side rooms, or just stood frozen in shock as the legend of the northern ranges padded past them with crystalline claws clicking on the floor. When they reached the juvenile enclosure, the cubs lost their minds completely. They threw themselves against the transparent barrier, crying out, their tails whipping with excitement. Shardwing responded with a low, rumbling vocalization that resonated through the floor, and Cass felt it in her chest, a sound of reassurance, of family, of pack bonds that transcended species understanding. The reunion was everything you'd expect, and nothing the researchers had protocols for. Shardwing entered the enclosure and was immediately swarmed by 3 overexcited cubs who climbed over him, bit his ears, rolled with him in the snow while making sounds of pure joy. The alpha tolerated it all with patience, occasionally pinning one of them gently with a paw to groom their fur or correct their behavior with a careful nip. It was beautiful. It was unprecedented. And it was absolutely against every regulation in the Coalition Handbook. The emergency staff meeting happened 3 hours later, with Cass sitting across from Solus while a dozen different department heads attended via hologram, all of them looking like they'd aged considerably in the past few days. "We cannot keep a wild apex predator at a research facility," the lead administrator stated, a floating gas being whose form rippled with agitation. "Liability alone would bankrupt the station, and Coalition law specifically prohibits long-term captivity of apex predators without extensive justification." "So we release them," Cass said. "The juveniles cannot survive in the wild yet," Solus countered. "They're too young, too dependent. They need at least another month of development and training. Then Shardwing trains them here." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when someone suggested something so absurd that brains needed time to process it. "Integration protocol," Cass continued, leaning forward. "Let the alpha stay at the facility temporarily. He teaches the cubs survival skills in a controlled environment. We get unprecedented research data on Frostfang pack dynamics and juvenile development. And when the cubs are ready, we release all of them together. Everyone wins." "That has never been done," the administrator said. "Cool. Let's make history." More silence. Then Solus's scales shifted to a color that might have been grudging respect. It could work. The juveniles would learn proper behaviors from their alpha. We could document the entire process, and a successful reintegration would be a major achievement for the Coalition's conservation efforts. "There's one condition," another administrator added, a crystalline being whose voice chimed like bells. "The alpha only tolerates personnel presence when the human is there, which means you'd need to be the liaison, Cass, the bridge between our facility and wild predator." "I can do that," Cass said, like being the only thing standing between cooperation and disaster was just another job requirement. And so began the strangest month in White Peak Station's history. Shardwing remained in the expanded enclosure, teaching the cubs how to hunt, how to read weather patterns, how to establish dominance and submission within pack dynamics. The cubs thrived under his guidance, their skills developing at rates that astonished the researchers. Cass was there for every session, the trusted presence that made Shardwing tolerate sensors, cameras, and the occasional medical scan. She became fluent in Frostfang body language, learned to read the subtle shifts in posture and vocalization that meant aggression versus play versus teaching. Renmi documented everything, her initial thesis about human recklessness evolving into something more complex. One evening, she found Cass reviewing footage in the observation deck, and finally asked the question that had been bothering her. "How did you know? That first day with the cubs, when you let them mouth your hands, how did you know they wouldn't kill you?" Cass was quiet for a moment, watching the screen where Shardwing was teaching Scrapper proper stalking technique. "I didn't. Not for sure. But I knew that fear would guarantee failure. If I'd gone in scared, they would have smelled it, responded to it, maybe even attacked, because that's what prey smells like. Trust at least gave us a chance. Your species evolved alongside predators, Renmi said slowly, her antennae quivering. You learned to read them because you had to. We domesticated wolves into dogs, Renmi. Not through domination, through mutual respect. We looked at creatures that could kill us and said, what if we were friends instead? And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Solus, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped inside. That level of trust shouldn't be possible between species that just met. The statistical likelihood of successful bonding with apex predators is— Maybe that's your problem, Cass interrupted gently. You're so focused on what could go wrong that you never discover what could go right. Sometimes you have to take the leap. Release day arrived with clear skies, a rarity on White Peak. The cubs were strong, trained, ready. Shardwing had assessed them with the critical eye of a leader who knew what survival required. And apparently, they'd passed. The enclosure doors opened to the wilderness beyond. Shardwing moved first, pausing at the threshold to look back at Cass. Those glowing eyes held something that might have been gratitude, might have been respect, might have been something that had no name in any language. The cubs followed, but not before each one approached Cass for a final goodbye. Gentle mouths on her hands, the same trust they'd shown that first day, now given freely. Scrapper, whisper, and drift. No longer failing, no longer lost, just young predators ready to claim their place in the world. They disappeared into the snow and ice, 4 white forms becoming part of the landscape, and Cass stood at the threshold watching until they were gone. Remarkable, Solus said quietly. Against all odds, against all protocols, you succeeded. We succeeded, Cass corrected. I just showed up and trusted them to be what they were meant to be. Renmi's documentary would eventually win awards across the coalition. Its thesis fundamentally changed. Humans, why do they do that? Became humans, the species that chooses trust. Her final notes read, they possess an extraordinary capacity for trust that borders on supernatural, and somehow, terrifyingly, magnificently, it works. Cass shipped out the following week, off to another assignment, another impossible situation. Her hands still bore scars from crystalline teeth, badges of honor that proved sometimes the craziest risks led to the most beautiful outcomes. And in the northern ranges of White Peak, a pack of 4 moved through the snow, led by an alpha who'd learned that trust could bridge the impossible gap between species, taught by a human who'd understood what everyone else had missed. That predators and prey, fear and trust, wild and tame, these weren't opposites. They were just choices. And humans, those magnificent lunatics, kept choosing trust.